Afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University, I would like to welcome all of you to what promises to be a brilliant and generative talk and discussion. My name is Joseph Winters. I am a professor in the Department of African and African American Studies as well as Religious Studies. I'm co-organizing this talk and discussion with Anne Maria Mukulu, who is my colleague in African and African American Studies as well as cultural anthropology. Before I introduce Professor Barbara Ransby, I want to give a shout out and say thank you to Tyra Dixon and Bettina Johnson for their tireless work in helping us organize this today. It is an honor for me to introduce Dr. Barbara Ransby, who is the John D. MacArthur Chair and Distinguished Professor in the Departments of African American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She also directs the campus-wide Social Justice Initiative, a project that promotes connections between academics and community organizers doing work on social justice. She is a graduate of Columbia University and the University of Michigan, where she was a Mellon Fellow. Dr. Ransby is author of 2 award-winning books, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, written in 2003, and Islanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson, written in 2013. She is also author of the 3rd book published in August 2018 entitled Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. She's a founding member of the National Organization Scholars for Social Justice and works closely with the Movement for Black Lives and the multiracial coalition, The Rising Majority. She serves on the board of directors at the Woods Fund of Chicago and the Grassroots Chicago-based Equity and Transformation, EAT, a group that supports formerly incarcerated persons and those working in the informal economy. I can't imagine a better model for being a scholar activist. I've used many of your work on Ella Baker as well as on Black Lives Matter in my classes. It always generates productive and energetic discussion. So I'm very glad to be introducing you here. And I'll be quiet and to introduce the talk. It's the title of the paper is Intersectionality and Internationalism, Mapping the 21st Century U.S. Black Freedom Movement. Thank you, Professor Ransby.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I trust you can hear me. The audio is working properly. Yes, I want to thank Professors Winter and Mukulu, and also to thank Tyra Dixon and Bettina Johnson, who made all the logistical details seem smooth. And we had a little tech moment, but that's par for the course. But here we are. So I'm happy to be with you virtually. I just recounted the weather situation here in Chicago, so I would much prefer to be with you in person, at least enjoying some respite from, our pretty harsh Chicago winter at the moment. But I want to talk to you both as a scholar and an activist, and I would be remiss not to name the political moment that we are in. It is not a routine political moment. We are I think at the precipice of some pretty major changes in this country and the world. I mean, it feels like both promise and peril, if you will. So the links between scholars and activists, building bridges between community and people organizing on the front lines of the freedom movement in this country, and those of us who study freedom struggles and social change and social transformation has never felt more urgent. So we witnessed the, whatever we want to call it, the attempted white nationalist coup in Washington on January 6th. We witnessed the rise of white nationalism throughout this country and an increasing vitriolic political divide. But as one of my young political comrades says, they are many, but we are more. So I remain optimistic that those people who took to the streets by the millions to protest the violent murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis way back in May, the many people who have joined organizations, created organizations, went to the polls under very adverse circumstances and sometimes dangerous circumstances, that those sentiments will will indeed prevail, that those values and that vision for the future will prevail. So I want to talk to you about my most recent book, which was on the movement for Black lives. And I'm a historian by training. So in some ways I was out of my element as a participant observer, really talking about history as it unfolded. But I want to highlight two very important themes that emerge when we look carefully at the movement for Black lives, or the Black Lives Matter movement. And that is the theme of intersectionality, which is of course the kind of locus of Black feminist organizing and thinking, and internationalism. And I say that in a moment where in movement circles and in academic circles, we contend with a real narrowing of the Black experience, a real parochialism around Blackness, as well as at the same time, a kind of essentializing of Blackness. And so what I find optimistic is a group of young organizers and thinkers who are wrestling with the issue of anti-Black racism, the legacy of colonialism and slavery, and the contemporary reality of the carceral state in very complex, nuanced, and I would say savvy and optimistic ways. So there are many ways to wade into this discussion about the movement for Black lives. Let me just say at the outset, we use the term Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a slogan, a term. It emerges out of Alicia Garza's use of the term at the point at which George Zimmerman, who had, the vigilante who murdered Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012, well, in 2013, of course, he was acquitted, and Alicia Garza, wrote this love letter to Black people, as she said, in which she ended with something to the equivalent of "Our lives matter, Black lives matter." She and Opal Tometi and Patrisse Cullors turned that slogan, into a platform, and it resonated for people. It resonated for people because in so many ways, those of us who had been doing organizing, those who have studied the Black experience, have seen and felt and experienced and resisted the consistent devaluation of Black life. And I want to be more specific. The consistent marginalization and devaluation of poor and working class Black lives, right? All Black lives, but particularly poor and working class Black lives. These are our brothers and sisters who fill the prisons. These are our brothers and sisters who experience the brunt of police violence. So it is both a racial analysis, but also a class analysis that the movement has confronted. So that is often seen as the origins of the movement, but I always like to add a pre-chapter. Actually, there are a couple of pre-chapters. But the immediate pre-chapter to Black Lives Matter as a slogan, as a term, as a sentiment that was galvanizing so many people was the formation of two organizations, Black Youth Project 100, which was formed right around the same time that the term Black Lives Matter was put out. A group of young people organizing, as they put it, through a Black, queer, feminist lens, were devastated, impacted, outraged by the murder of Trayvon Martin, and began to decide what kind of organization they were going to be, which was a political organization of organizers focused on Black youth and focused on social transformation and liberation. But from a feminist point of view, and even at that early point, from an internationalist point of view, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the formation of Black Youth Project 100, or BYP 100, which still exists and has a number of chapters around the country, and the formation in Florida a year earlier of an organization called the Dream Defenders. The Dream Defenders, in their founding document, talked about not only confronting white supremacy and capitalism, but also patriarchy. One of their early group activities was to take a delegation of young organizers of color to Palestine, to the occupied Palestinian territories. So again, intersectionality and internationalism were both at the forefront of their organizing impulse. But it's significant because both of those organizations were also base building organizations. They weren't, think tanks. They weren't top down elite, small tight teams. They were organizations that went out and tried to mobilize large numbers of people in direct action. So that's the kind of precursor to what we usually mark as the moment that Black Lives Matter began. Black Lives Matter, of course, and I won't go into all the various phases of its evolution, but it eventually evolves into the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which had then chapters around the country and several outside of the country. But Black Lives Matter Global Network then itself became a part of something larger, which I now work with, called the Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of over 100 Black-led organizations, which have been organizing around not only racist police violence in prisons, but organizing around raising the minimum wage, organizing around evictions, anti-eviction campaigns, organizing around climate justice and Black-led climate justice movements, such as the one led by Colette Pichon Battle in the Gulf area, very much at the center of the movement for Black lives. So when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, we are talking about an ecosystem of organizations, not one organization, and certainly not 3 or 4 people whose names and faces you might know. Spontaneous protests to injustice and outrages happen, but it is organizers and organizations that turn that outrage into a movement, that turns it into something that can be sustained. And that's what we've seen with the evolution of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives. When I look at the movement as a historian and an activist, like any historical development, we see continuities and ruptures, right? So 3 significant things I want to just raise up in terms of how we analyze and assess the political intervention of the movement for Black lives. And let me just also say parenthetically, and maybe it goes without saying, this iteration of the Black freedom movement has made a profound, profound impact on every aspect of life, from media to professional sports, to the academy, to criminal justice reform, if we use that kind of outdated term, but to the contestation of the carceral state. It has made a profound impact. It has energized and mobilized and put into motion more people than we've ever seen in motion around a single set of demands in this country's history, right? The New York Times estimated some 26 million people participated in protests in the middle of a very dangerous and deadly pandemic in the wake of George Floyd's death. That's a culmination of 6 years of organizing. And I'm certainly not suggesting that a single organization or coalition organize all of those protests in every 50 state in every one of the 50 states, but they gave a frame, they gave an analysis, and they gave a set of demands that helped to galvanize and direct and shape those protests. Okay, so I want to just come back to these 2 themes of internationalism and intersectionality when we look at this large ecosystem of the movement for Black lives. In that ecosystem, includes organizations like the Blackout Collective, which is an organization of women. Most of them came out of the West Coast, and they went around giving tactical training to people who were engaged in direct action protests. People who waded out into rush hour traffic to do sit-ins, to sit down and stop the flow of traffic in major cities across the country. You don't just do that on a whim. They gave a tactical training for organizers, and they were, kind of commonly known as, the women who shut shit down. Pardon the language, but very, kind of determined militant type tactics. Another group is BOLD, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, which is a political education and strategic training project, which many of the Movement for Black Lives leaders have gone through. So there's infrastructure, there's tactics, there's strategy. All of this goes into, all of these are ingredients in movement building and movement making. And so, I think a lot of times I hear pundits talk about these spontaneous outbursts or talk about Black Lives Matter in as if it is a spontaneous set of events, rather than a movement that in a very conscientious and conscious way, has evolved. Imperfect, absolutely. Made mistakes, absolutely. Complicated, flawed, beautiful human beings, always. But nevertheless, a movement that has been forward-looking and impactful in enormous ways. So back to the three things that I wanted to highlight that I think kind of capture the spirit of this movement. One is it represents a firm break with the hierarchical, male-centered leadership that has dominated Black politics for the better part of the 20th century. The most prominent spokespersons and leaders, the behind-the-scenes organizers, the tacticians and the strategists, the movement intellectuals were overwhelmingly identified as Black feminists, as intersectional Black feminists, and also as internationalists. One of the early campaigns with some of the BYP 100 leaders out of Chicago was to go to the United Nations Committee Against Torture and expose the Chicago police and their brutality. But thinking of going to an international body, they traveled to Geneva to offer testimony, was a part of a kind of global frame of not seeing the work as limited to the boundaries of the United States. Similarly, of course, and we know this, there were solidarity demonstrations around the country with each phase of this movement's activity, from, Michael Brown's murder in 2014 in Ferguson to the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. Not only were there protests and solidarity that happened in parallel time, but many of the Movement for Black Lives leaders have organized delegations. I mentioned the one to Palestine, but delegations to Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, to Haiti, to South Africa. People have deliberately tried to make connections, to draw links and parallels. A new table or committee within the Movement for Black Lives is the Cross Movement and International Solidarity table, which is, already been in conversation with folks doing solidarity work around Eritrea and Ethiopia. So, but a break with the hierarchical male-centered leadership, it was an important characteristic. When Al Sharpton went to Ferguson, essentially got booed off the stage. I mean, people were very impatient with this kind of male clergy presence that wanted them to be the backdrop to his press conference. When Angela Davis went, it was a very different kind of reception, and I asked some of the young people I interviewed for the book, Angela's actually older than Reverend Sharpton. I said, well, was this just a generational thing? And they said, no, it's a political thing. One young woman said, she didn't come to mold us and scold us. So this kind of idea of reciprocity and respect across the generational divide was very important, but Angela Davis's feminist politics also resonated for many of the leaders who were emerging out of that struggle. I also, trace some of the thinking and some of the frames and some of the language back to really three organizations: the Feminist Caucus of the Black Radical Congress from the 1990s, which is something I was involved in, Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and Critical Resistance. Now, these three entities were very much a part of a recent Black radical tradition. And people who participated in, led, and wrote about those 3 chapters were very influential in this phase of the movement for Black lives. So feminist ideas and feminist praxis. Now, the other thing the movement has done, both around gender norms and around class politics, is to reject the politics of respectability. The people who have borne the brunt and felt the most severe forms of police violence and who fill the prisons are people that sometimes more quote unquote respectable in a traditional sense leaders might not hold up as deserving of our attention, of our support, of our love. And this movement has really put those people at the center, including LGBTQ people, especially trans people who have been the victims of enormous police and vigilante violence. So really rejecting this idea that the sort of best and brightest get put forward to convince the rest of the world that Black people are deserving of rights and resources and values. So really rejecting that kind of bourgeois strategy for movement. The other thing that's significant is new models of leadership. And they're new in some ways and not new in others. But a real decentralized leadership model. When Movement for Black Lives first emerged, a number of observers said, where are the leaders? This is a leaderless movement. That is going to be its downfall. And of course, Patrice Kahn-Cullors, one of the founders of BLM Global Network, responded, we are a leaderful movement. So not leaderless, but leaderful. And I have to say, I appreciated and felt particularly optimistic to see Ella Baker's words centered on t-shirts, in speeches, in documents that came out of that movement, talking about the importance of grassroots organizing, talking about the importance of decentering kind of masculinist models of leadership. And that's very much what this movement has done. The other thing I'd like to say, which I think also borrows from an intersectional Black feminist tradition, is that while there have been concrete demands, and some of the most recent ones, of course, defund the police, which is actually often misconstrued because, the other part of that demand is not just to defund the police, but also to build, to invest, to divest from policing and state violence, and to invest in communities, in schools, in jobs, in housing, et cetera. But the demands that have come out of the movement are practical ones and visionary ones. And some people thought the demand for defund the police was, a pretty wild demand until we began to see a chipping away at police budgets, a kind of interrogation of an unquestioned funding and excess funding for police forces, right? So the logic that we will be safer the more money we spend on policing is on the defensive. That is a part of the visionary aspect of the movement, of talking about systemic change and not simply narrow, siloed demands. And I'm often reminded of James Baldwin when I think of some of the documents that have come out of the movement, the Vision for Black Lives, which was first offered up in August of 2016, and then more recently, the Breathe Act, which has called for the end of cash bail, a whole number of interventions that would take an emphasis off of the punishment industry, would take resources away from the punishment industry and invest them in communities. These were seen as kind of outlandish at some point. But I'm reminded of, of James Baldwin, who said, demand the impossible, right? Demand the impossible, and then fight as hard as you can to make it real. So in many ways, this generation of activists have challenged some of the very foundational logics of the society we live in, the kind of mindless growth logic, the punishment and policing will make you safe logic, the charismatic leader will save you logic, and have really pushed us to dream radically and to dream big. And I think that is the moment we're in, the convergence of a number of crises, including the COVID epidemic, the protests that we saw, throughout the country last year, and of course the crisis of governance and government. All of this creates new opportunities to think outside the box, to not think backward, but to think forward. And we in Chicago are launching something very soon that we're calling the Portal Project, which is borrowing from a quote by Arundhati Roy, who talks about the pandemic as portal. It's kind of a flip of Naomi Klein's notion of disaster capitalism, where she documents so powerfully the ways in which capitalist elites have taken advantage of crises in order to further processes of privatization and exploitation that they wouldn't have been able to implement in normal times. But the idea of pandemic as portal or crisis as portal invites us to do the opposite, to say that in this surreal moment where so many things have happened that we didn't anticipate, where we've been able to change our lives in ways that we didn't think we could, that we have seen so much suffering, but we've also seen renewed sense of community and connection in unexpected ways, and generosity. In that context, in this moment, can we indeed, imagine a different way of being going forward and begin to move toward the kind of foundational and systemic change that this moment so loudly cries out for? And I indeed hope we can. So I will stop there. And I was asked to leave plenty of time for exchange and conversation, and not just questions, because I don't have all the answers, but I'm happy to elaborate on anything that I've said or intimated.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ransby, thank you so much. I think that Joe and I are going to do a little, well, we do have some questions, and hopefully we can stimulate a conversation. And then for people who are in the audience, you can start posting questions of your own or observations of your own in the chat, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Joe, do you want to start, or do you want me to start? You want me to start? Okay. So actually, I really, perhaps some context. So Joe and I very much wanted to engage with you and your work because we co-taught a course beginning last fall, well, 2 falls ago, on the Black radical tradition. And then I taught it solo this past fall, a little bit updated. And so Joe and I have been in conversation together for quite a while. And to be explicit about it, sitting in very different positions, albeit in the same unit in African and African-American studies, Joe is an Americanist and me as an Africanist, and trying to work through actually some of these questions around internationalism. So I guess I have a question from the very beginning of your comments, which has to do with what you referred to as a kind of deepening narrowing or deepening parochialism. And I can guess where some of that might be coming from, but I was just curious to hear, both in terms of the scholarship, but also perhaps in terms of a politics, where you imagine that parochialism to be coming from.
Well, I mean, to be really specific, in the debate around reparations, there has emerged a new set of conversations and debates about who is deserving of reparations in this context, and there are organizations that AAAS is one, which advocates that it is only people who are the descendants of enslaved people in the United States who are a part of that reparations, which puts certain kind of brackets on who is Black and who is not. And of course, we know that slavery was an international system. It was a transatlantic system, and people who ended up here, and my ancestors who ended up here, came through the Caribbean, came through, a number of places, and the way that the economy of slavery worked was one that there was a lot of movement, and the way that resistance movements have worked and grown over the decades and the generations, has been through a kind of what I think of as a radical Pan-Africanism, and sometimes a radical left connection between Black people and colonized people around the world. So it's that more global, capacious definition of Blackness that I embrace and that I think is most hopeful. But in very concrete political terms, if I can share, there is an argument there, and it's been pretty ferocious on social media and so forth. So yeah, that's part of what I was referring to.
Okay, that's actually not where I thought you were going to go, but I appreciate it as I appreciate it as a South Africanist, because that debate about reparations is echoed, or even in some ways anticipated, in the South African context, moving into the transition to democracy in the mid-1990s. And then the effort of the new government to narrow the field of who can specifically in that context make claims for land. So reparations specifically in terms of land claims. And I've always wondered, one, about the sort of common sense of how the claim sort of machinery was narrowed by a time frame. So you can only make a claim if it's within this historical date to this historical date. That was one way of narrowing. But also in relationship to the United States and elsewhere, where conversations about reparations are taking place. Wouldn't it have been, in the best of all possible worlds, thinking radically about radical alternatives, to connect the dots between all of those geographical places which have been subjected to settler colonialism, to slavery, or been ports for the slave trade, and so on? And so why were these things being thought analytically apart from one another, when in fact they're really all part of the same systemic problem? Yeah.
Well, we agree. I mean, I'm curious where you thought I was headed when I took a detour in a different direction. But while you think about answering that, let me just also say, the struggle in South Africa was is still very close to my heart, but I was very involved in the anti-apartheid and free South Africa movement. Some of my very, very beloved colleagues and friends and comrades were involved in that struggle and suffered a lot because of their involvement in it. And it's one of those places on the planet right now, and I don't know how you would weigh in on this, but there's also peril and promise, I would say, very discreetly. But in some ways, many of us probably had unrealistic expectations about what was going to happen after the fall of apartheid, but profoundly disappointed that the dreams of freedom weren't realized in the way that many of us had imagined.
Yeah, I think we all probably fell in, or some of us fell into the trap of imagining that emancipation later means you've learned the lessons of other people's mistakes, and I think there was a fairly rapid transition, certainly amongst scholarly circles, from thinking sort of Marxism to Fanonianism, that there was a real challenge there around what the new national culture would be, and so on. So it's a bit of a sidebar, but actually what I thought you were going to say is a possible response to my question about parochialism was to invoke the debates around Afropessimism, which seem to me very centered on the United States and don't leave space for, well, possibly beyond the Americas, a conversation about Black ontology, but that's sort of where I thought you might be going.
And that's one of the paths I could have gone down. In fact, when I was first thinking about this conversation, I talk about both of these, these trends, Afropessimism and the sort of ADOS impulse, if you will, which I think both are limited, if I can be tactful, and disturbing if I were to be more candid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So I had a question, but I'm wondering if I should. I like in tables. Maybe I ask a question about about hope, right? Since we talked about pessimism, what I noticed, I mean, throughout your talk, you talked about, right, a kind of optimism, right, that you have, but a kind of cautious optimism. This relationship between peril, peril and promise. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about like the politics of hope. I'm thinking here about the way in which hope can get mustered and mobilized to do so, right? To do the work of reproducing all kinds of things that we would want to resist. I'm thinking here of like the regime of hope with Obama and so forth, right? Where the hope can become a kind of optimism, a kind of commitment to progress. But this kind of like peril promise. If you could just say a little bit more about, maybe something like a radical democratic politics of hope, and how that for you is maybe is very much connected to and maybe derives from your activism, right, in a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I like that, the radical politics of hope. I mean, the problem with Obama's deployment of hope is that there was a lot of hope, but there wasn't the delivery, right? So I think, I mean this in the most secular way imaginable, but I mean, I think that there's a little bit of faith, and I know you're a religious studies person, but this question of faith, for me, it's secular faith. It's as a sort of secular humanist, it's faith in human beings, it's faith in the hunger and desire we have, and our ability to kind of overcome cynicism and overcome our own limitations to do what we can together to create new possibilities. And I guess I've lived long enough now and been involved in enough campaigns and struggles and organizations that have won and lost various things that that I choose the optimism. I mean, I'm not basically an optimistic person. I'm a worrier, which I think makes me a better organizer, because I'm always worried about what can go wrong. And so hopefully that makes fewer things go wrong. But no, I think, in this moment too, and I was just on in a meeting earlier where someone said, we're really in a crisis of not only science, but truth, with movements like QAnon, and, you can't have a fierce but rational debate about what you believe, because there is such rumor and myth and fantasy and nonsensicalness that it makes that difficult. So in the midst of all that, finding faith in what we don't know is, what we don't know in terms of a guarantee, but what we hope through our own work, our own agency, our own determination that we can create, is kind of where I choose to invest, because I've seen things change in ways that I really didn't anticipate. And I have to confess, I've said this to my students at times. When I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, first at Columbia and then at Michigan as a graduate student, and I had dear comrades who were in exile who thought they would never go back. I didn't really think we would win. I didn't think we would win even in a limited way. I wasn't sure that in my lifetime, apartheid would fall. And, we had all these campaigns around, both Free Mandela, and we had, University of Michigan gave him an honorary degree in absentia and all this. And I, we did this all with some hope, but, I think when you do see large scale changes occur that you didn't anticipate, it fuels that optimistic spirit that human beings together, are, force for change. I mean, that was my attraction to history, as a discipline, because it's a study of change over time. So we know things will change. We just don't know exactly how, but we know that we're part of that story. And so the activist in me then invests in that as a part of investing in a hopeful, future.
So I have a question about internationalism or international solidarity, and specifically about the flow of ideas, the flow of practices, the flow of inspiration, the direction. And I'm hoping the answer is that it's circular, that that things go round and round.
Intent, huh?
But I will say, again, this is sort of thinking through this as an Africanist and having done some work on the most recent student protests in South Africa, which is to say, beginning about 4 or 5 years ago, which became hashtag movements, the Fees Must Fall, and also Roads Must Fall movements. And one direction of circulation was obviously from South Africa to the UK, from the University of Cape Town to Oxford. And that's a relatively easy set of directions and echoes and recurrences to follow. But I will say, working in the US as an Africanist, very often the way that those sort of co-constitutions and circulations of ideas and inspiration tends to be narrated as originating in the United States. And so I'm curious about what these moments of solidarity with Palestine, or in the examples that you cited of members of the movement for Black Lives, traveling to South Africa or Brazil, what those moments of solidarity look like. Are they in fact exchanges? That's, I think, really the way I'm trying to ask this question.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll say 4 things quickly. We hope that it's circular. We, both in terms of the inspiration and the lessons. And I mean, sometimes it's the US to other parts of the world, and then sometimes it's a kind of romanticization of struggles elsewhere, right? So the site of heroic struggles are outside the US, and it is another kind of fetishizing of struggles elsewhere. But I think, there's ways in which we see parallels in struggles in other parts of the world. I certainly, my own visit to Palestine, I saw a lot of parallels in terms of the criminalization of youth and the surveillance economy that exists in there. So there are parallel struggles. So that's sort of one aspect of a solidarity model, and when Ferguson occurred, many people in occupied territory, in fact, there were people in Gaza were sending messages, and this has become part of the lore, sending messages about how people on the street should survive tear gas from the police because they had experienced so much tear gas from the Israelis. But the other is, and I'm reminded, my colleague Nadine Naber, who has done a lot of work on Arab feminism and Egyptian revolution, talks about the importance of us also recognizing US policy in the world and our obligation living here to not just talk about parallel struggles, but talk about intersecting and global systems of domination. So we often talk about Palestine as a situation of settler colonialism. Of course, US is a situation of settler colonialism. But US policy vis-a-vis Israel, US policy vis-a-vis Central America, which is really fueled much of the migration crisis that we see in the region, has to be a part of our language and analysis of solidarity. The other thing is, the third thing I'll say is, there's a kind of generalization of American solidarity movements. Many years ago, the solidarity with the people of El Salvador, solidarity with Nicaragua, or, these were often white-led movements, and people talked about themselves here as Americans in solidarity with the people of, struggling in another country. So when we deal with our very different experiences as Indigenous, Black, and other people of color in this country, and I won't just say generically people of color, but Latinx folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks in particular in this country, there's a different relationship to the state and to state power. And so then when we go on delegations, when we look for parallels, it's not only the question of what is the US government doing to, our people or our, parallel movements in other parts of the world, but also those same things are being done to us, but not to everybody. And then the final thing I guess I'll say, which it's always hard, is the importance of building solidarity that tries as much as we can to understand the complexity and uniqueness of every site of struggle. And, of course, since we're talking about South Africa, when the African National Congress and the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, were at odds, and the anti-apartheid movement in this country, they at one point wouldn't share a stage together. So movements here had to decide, if you were inviting speakers, do you invite an ANC speaker or a PAC speaker? And what that meant was you had to actually know what the politics of each formation was, and you had to make certain kinds of choices. Now that can be, people are much more comfortable saying, it's not my struggle, I'm not there, I just want to support it generically. But I think sometimes that also becomes a cop-out because, there often is not a generic struggle. There are people fighting for different kinds of things in different places, and we have to be literate in one another's struggles in order to be meaningful in our gestures and our movements of solidarity.
Great, thank you.
Maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So one question that I have, one of the many things that I appreciate about your work is, to go back to a point you just said, a kind of complexity, the way that you that your interpretation and your kind of thick description of Black Lives Matter, right? And Black Lives Matters, or the movement for Black Lives, relationship to other movements and models of grassroots organizing. I'm wondering, I mean, as you mentioned, there are limitations to any movement, right? But you give a kind of complex but also hopeful reading of the movement for Black Lives. I'm wondering how you respond to those critics. I think of some of your colleagues, right? Some of the critics of Black Lives Matter that talk about it being co-opted, talk about it being co-opted by I don't know, MSNBC or Republicans, wearing kente cloth or and I'm just wondering, like, but it seems to me that what you're suggesting is, well, I imagine you would say, well, of course that happens. Co-opting always happens, but it's also something about like the complexity that can't be maybe right captured by those other Jeff Bezos of the world giving, you know, millions of dollars or something like that. I'm just, or even just the critique that this is just another form of identity politics, right? I mean, I'm just wondering how your work, you know, your work and your activism might respond to some of those criticisms.
Right. Well, you know, first of all, so the movement for Black Lives is this network coalition, and there are different forces in it, and people debate and argue, and everybody is not on the same page, right? That is a part of, you know, what a kind of radical democratic movement does. So there are positions that get taken, and things that individuals and individual organizations do that everyone doesn't agree with, and that I don't agree with. So that's, you know, that's one. And I, you know, pretty public about the things that I disagree with. I try to do that respectfully. But in terms of it being an identity, you know, it's identity politics only. I think that only people that can reasonably say that are people who have really not listened to, read. I mean, the movement has produced documents, right? So the most recent one is the Breathe Act. The earlier document is the Vision for Black Lives, which has now also been kind of updated. They're very lengthy documents. And they talk about all kinds of policy changes, and they talk about positions against settler colonialism and racial capitalism, positions in support of labor organizing and you know, a decent wage, a living wage. They talk about reproductive justice. They talk about climate change. I mean, these are large sets of demands that are not just going to affect Black people, right? So it's not like, let's just get our own, or it's not, and it's also doesn't let Black people off the hook who are in positions of power, who are leveraging that power in a way that's antithetical to the best interests of some of the most long-suffering members of our community. You know, I say, when you look at critique of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, who was killed, several of the cops involved in Freddie Gray's murder were Black cops. The movement did not spare them from criticism. The movement has criticized Black elected officials, has criticized Black police chiefs and DAs for harsh treatment of protesters and of you know, people in their communities. And so it is a systemic analysis. It's not a celebratory, we all Black and that's all that matters. You know, it's not that simple-minded. And anyone who suggests that is not honest or is not paying attention. So, you know, I mean, now, is there some areas where there's not total consensus or total clarity or total sharpness in the way that we might like? Of course, but, you know, it is a movement, and it is a work in progress, and it does have, you know, weaknesses and contradictions for sure. I would, you know, we can easily kind of look back on past movements. You know, people talk about the Panthers or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and we package those movements and organizations in such a way that it now makes sense to us, and, you know, you either critique it or you support it. But there was major contestation within SNCC, major contestation within the Panthers, and there were, I would say, some co-optation in both cases. There were people who were, you know, their egos were bigger than their political commitments. And there were people who, you know, quite frankly, you know, worked for the FBI, who were, you know, in positions of power in these organizations that people didn't know then. So it is more than a notion to build and to try to sustain a movement in the era of surveillance, in the era of a violent state and violent vigilantism, you know. So yeah, I am sure, you know, many critiques are warranted, and they should be shared and debated. You know, that is a part of it. They shouldn't be suppressed, but they should be informed.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks.
So I'm going to go to the chat and to some of the questions there, and I'm going to try and interpret them as best as I can. So I think maybe this particular question is relevant and something of a segue, but it has to do with movement building. The question has to do with the composition of, can I call it the crowd, right? So during the summer, those 26 million people all over the country and indeed across the world who were protesting in the face of the murder of George Floyd. I think this question is about who constitutes the crowd, as it were, or the what seems to be emerging as a movement at that moment. It's diversity of composition, and if I could append a question, something there about allyship. So allyship gets thrown around as a term a lot, and so what does that mean in terms of what the summer looked like, and what does the movement look like now in relationship to the summer?
Well, yeah, we're trying to find a better term than allyship, and some better, some terms have been offered: co-conspirators, collaborators, co-liberators. But yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, just to be blunt, there were a lot of white people in the streets, and under the banner of opposing racism. Some of them came from organizations. Some of them were indeed, in organized left formation. Some of them were just angry and wanting to do the right thing. Some of them were anarchists. When you have a relatively spontaneous uprising, it is a mix of all kinds of forces. I mean, I can't recite it, but I can paraphrase C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian thinker and radical. I had this quote about the process of people traveling and transforming a society. And he said, there's humor, there's vulgarity, there's contradiction, there's colorfulness, there's tragedy, all mixed up in it. So these were not scripted protests. And, I mean, the movement can't possibly determine or dictate everything that's going to happen. Now, the looting was a particularly controversial part of it. There were Black people and white people and other people involved in that activity. But, if you have a society that dangles things in front of, particularly young people and says you're important if you have things, but you don't have the wherewithal to get those things, when the rules get suspended, you can expect that people are going to take some of those things because they're angry, and because they feel disenfranchised. Now, I would like a society where we do have redistribution of wealth. I don't think that's the way to do it because, of course, like land redistribution that Mugabe announced in Zimbabwe at one point was sort of random, just go get some land. So whoever gets there first gets it. So movement didn't say this is our strategy, but I think there is a way to understand some of the behavior of the crowd that wasn't scripted by movement, but definitely comes out of a political anger and an economic disenfranchisement that we can understand as we strive for more impactful, effective, and sustainable ways to move to a different kind of political economy. Now, the role of whites in the movement and this question of allyship, it's not as simple as saying the role of whites, because I think there were people in many places who took the leadership of people who've borne the brunt of racist violence and asked movements, how can we support you? Then there were people who also came, and I witnessed some of this, who felt we know better than you what needs to happen here. We have our own tactical agenda. And we're not listening to the people who actually called this demonstration or the people who've been organizing around this issue before we got here. And so that kind of sometimes left arrogance within social movements becomes a different kind of problem. So yeah, so I mean, it's all part of the work to figure out what is an effective and principled strategy for organizing, but also to understand that we don't control every part of it, and that some of it unravels in ways we never would have predicted. And then organizers can come in and say, what should happen now? And I think that's sometimes the best intervention.
So I have a question about really about asking you, Professor Ransby, to elaborate on the rejection of bourgeoisie politics and the politics of respectability. What would be the criteria? It says for the ideal representatives, but I guess what would be the criteria for representatives to lead the movement for social justice forward? Yeah.
Well, I think we're all needed. But one of the lessons I think I learned from my work on Ella Baker for many, many years was this idea, which Bell Hooks and other feminists, including the Combahee River Collective and others, have articulated over the years, is how do we put the most marginal at the center, right? So, the people who are bearing the brunt of this pandemic, of police violence, are Black people, but they're not college professors and they're not doctors and lawyers. I mean, sometimes we get caught up in it and get racially profiled too, like everyone else. But for the most part, it's people who live in a certain community, people who have certain economic vulnerabilities, et cetera, people who have been incarcerated. So to put the most marginal or the most marginalized, the people who the society would most readily or is actively marginalizing at the center is the best way to not throw anybody under the bus. The politics of respectability, I mean, and I've talked to a number of colleagues who have slightly different take on this, but when we talk about politics of respectability, talking about that idea which surfaces in the Black movement, which surfaces in the immigrant rights movement, which is to say, we're not who you think we are. We're just like you. We're just a little browner. We're respectable. We're hardworking. We're church going. We are patriotic. We're not lawbreakers. So this idea of overcompensating, if you will, or conforming in every way except that one variable that you feel makes you vulnerable, is a way of reinforcing hierarchies and buying into a kind of exceptionalism that does in fact throw other groups under the bus. I mean, in the immigrant rights narrative, for example, and some very wonderful people in organized communities against deportations and Mi Gente and others and United We Dream have pushed back against this. But some of that narrative is around the politics of respectability of, we are so decent and upstanding and upright and honorable, that's why we should be included, as opposed to, we may have made mistakes and done things wrong and like everybody else, but we still deserve the same kind of valuing and the same kind of human recognition as everyone else does. So, similarly, the movement for Black Lives is saying it doesn't matter what Mike Brown was doing the morning that he was shot. It doesn't matter if George Floyd was, which it's not even clear that he was doing this, but passing a counterfeit $20 bill. It doesn't matter if Eric Garner was selling loose cigarettes, which is the violation of some sort of ordinance on Staten Island, that those actions shouldn't have been a death sentence. When many of the, civil rights leaders in the South settled on Rosa Parks as a symbol of the movement, that her case, she wasn't the first, we know this story, she wasn't the first Black woman to sit down on the bus and defy the Jim Crow segregation code. But people rallied around her because they felt like she was marketable as a respectable, honorable, decent woman, as opposed to, say, the young woman Claudette Colvin, who weeks before had gotten kicked off the bus, but who had, fought the bus driver and cursed him out and everything else, which didn't present the kind of image that the movement elders were trying to present, or the movement clergy were trying to present at that time. So this is the last thing I'll say on this. It is a really important point, though, because if conforming and blending in, right, or aspiring to a certain middle class norm of respectability is the condition for being safe, for having rights and resources, or in some cases just being alive, we have lowered the bar. We have already lost the battle in terms of potential for transformation. Ella Baker used to do this organizing in the South, and she would go into these little towns, and the NAACP would, the leadership of the NAACP would often be, a local minister, a local dentist, a local barber who owned their own barber shop, or, small business owners, and people with certain kinds of credentials, teachers. And she said she would ask people, are you prepared to fight for the rights of, as she put it, bluntly, the town drunk? Which in those little towns, everyone knew who that was, was somebody who might talk loud, drink too much, get thrown in jail on a Friday night. That person had to be someone that the movement was also worried about, and centering their experience more than people who had a certain margin of class privilege. So I hope that was not too long-winded and it remotely responded to that person's question.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Just again, a sort of sidebar, but your argument reminds me of the really awful response, I think, from the court, jurors, and also the media in the George Zimmerman case, when the late Trayvon Martin's friend, who'd been on the other end of the phone when he was shot, Rachel, I think Jeantel or something, testified, and the way that she was portrayed by media was precisely as not having the kind of respectability that would make her a reliable or legitimate witness. So
right.
I mean, I think yeah, that's absolutely
right. So that's a good example. Or if we were, before his, fall from grace, if you will, Bill Cosby was a champion of the politics of respectability.
Yeah.
Pull your pants up, don't name your children names that don't sound mainstream, and speak in a certain way. And I mean, he chastised and sought to humiliate Black working class people for being their own worst victims, for not conforming to what he thought was a modicum of middle class respectability. And Barack Obama, had several speeches that reiterated that same point. Pookie needs to take off his house shoes and get out and march, or you need to be responsible for yourself, young man. Now, you might tell your son or cousin or neighbor that as an individual strategy for survival in a hostile terrain, but as a political message, is very problematic because it lets the system off the hook that creates the conditions that people live under.
Yeah. So this is another audience question, and it has to do with internationalism. Does internationalism allow for agenda setting from outside the US in matters that are assumed to be articulations? And how are these allies allowed to be other than props for US-centered agendas?
Well, I wish there was a formula. I think being sensitive to the principles that guide our solidarity work is the best guardrail we have against what the person asking the question is warning against. And I will say I've seen it work both ways equally offensive in terms of US, US activists either having, struggles in other parts of the world be props for a US centered agenda, or absolving all responsibility to fight where they are and romanticizing and kind of, reifying struggles, in other parts of the world. So, again, I think there are parallel struggles and then there's intersecting struggles, and to understand the centrality of the United States and US policy in wreaking havoc in so many parts of the world, both helps to define our task in doing solidarity work, but also should underscore our humility in how we connect with and reach out to activists in other parts of the world. I mean, I think, there's so many layers to this. I mean, language is one thing. We have many conversations and debates about world politics where everyone is expected to speak English, and the English speakers are so impatient with translation. Like, this meeting is going to take forever. As opposed to adherence to a principle that, everybody in the world doesn't speak English or want to speak English, and that there's a certain power and centering in having all of our exchanges and debates, be in the language, of empire.
I'm looking at a question. What methodological and ideological shifts need to take place in African American churches, community and grassroots efforts that will not be driven by capitalist practices for this intersectional practice to be a bridge building movement today towards future generations? I'm not sure they're thinking about the kind of mega church prosperity gospel. I'm not sure, but it seems like
that might be a question for you, Professor.
No. But it's also it's African American churches, but also community and grassroots efforts. I think there's a concern about, right, the kind of the way in which capitalist practices kind of structure, right, kind of structure things.
Oh yeah, I mean, there is that at one end of the spectrum, the mega churches, like many aspiring capitalist enclaves, where there often is enormous disparity in the same way there is in the larger society, where the clerical elite are doing quite well for themselves, and the people at the bottom are aspiring and hoping and contributing to that wealth. But then at the other end of the spectrum, Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign has really, worked tirelessly to reach and revive a progressive faith community. And there are many of those people who have showed up at Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and not shown up to say, I'm the leader, I'm gonna pray and then speak to the press, or telling people to calm down and go home or be peaceful, but coming and accepting the leadership of some of the young queer Black people who've been out there, on bullhorns and giving direction to the movement. So I think, like with everything else, there is contestation and struggle within the faith community about how to deploy the moral authority, the material resources, and what has to be given up, which, one obvious thing is kind of, patriarchal ethos that dominates most religions, I would say. But yeah, I don't know. Do you want to add something?
No, I think that's great. I think it's interesting. Emery and I, like we said, we taught that course a couple of years ago. And we read Patrice Cullors' kind of memoir, right, what it means to be called a terrorist, and the importance of the West African traditions of Ifa, right, which have potentially have a more space for kind of priestesses, and for kind of kind of a different understanding of leadership within those traditions. So just kind of thinking back to part of your point about that the push against and the rejection of kind of male-dominated patriarchal forms of leadership would have to go across the kind of secular religious divide, or secularist religious faith. I think you're right. Yeah.
There's also, I will say this, in one of the other things I'm hopeful about, I'm gonna come off sounding like a real bona fide optimist, which most people who know me well would be surprised to hear. But one of the things in Movement for Black Lives circles is when I've gone to retreats and meet, long all-day meetings or two-day meetings, or there's always an altar for the ancestors, a kind of spiritual place to remember, to recognize, to center yourself about why you're there, about who you're fighting the fight for. So I just say that to say, alternative forms of spiritual practice as grounding people who are making difficult choices and sacrifices to be involved in movement, I think isn't, it's another hopeful sign and maybe lessons for more organized religious leaders and organizations.
Definitely.
So this is shifting gears a little bit to bring this back into the space of the academy. And this is a question about creating anti-racism pedagogy and curriculum in academia. And this person says, I'm feeling frustrated with the seemingly lack of awareness among faculty in my department, in parentheses in the humanities, about our white-centered pedagogy and curriculum. Can you suggest any strategies to enact practical change at the pedagogical level? Yes, please.
Yes. Well, I don't know the person who's asking the question, so I don't, we can do different things depending on where we are in our careers and all this kind of thing. But many universities and colleges have been jolted into action, by the protests of last year. And, my own university, there's task forces and committees and commissions and reports and, what can we do? So I think that offers an opportunity for us to step in and to raise pedagogical questions. In the rigid classroom setting, it can be intimidating for students, whoever's at the front of the classroom. And often we are trained as academics. We're not trained as teachers. We are trained in our content areas, and then we're thrown in front of a class. But to figure out creative ways to connect with students, to break out of the grid, to embrace that kind of Freirean approach of every student is a teacher, every teacher is a student, to map the dynamics of power in our classrooms, right? Which, depending on the subject you're teaching and the size of the class and who you are, may vary. And I've had a number of experiences. I've really learned a lot in activist circles about popular education, about experiential learning. We do capstone courses and internships as forms of learning in some of the programs that I teach in. I've also taught in prisons, and that is a lesson too, because you don't have very much power and you don't have very much maneuverability, and ways in which you can affirm the humanity and brilliance of your students in a prison makes you really think outside the box about what you do when you're not in the prison as a teacher, which is sometimes by, out of reflex. I have actually found teaching online this last year both a challenge, but also challenging my creative powers, to be more compassionate toward my students, to know that we're all navigating a very, very difficult and painful terrain, you, in Zoom learning, you're invited really into their living room, bedroom, den, front porch, wherever they are. So you see you see your students in context, and not just in the classroom as anonymous, people without a larger context and a larger history. So that also motivates me to try to be a more, I guess, caring teacher, which we don't, that doesn't sound very academic, right? To be a caring teacher. But I think that's what's called upon. Now, I think, pedagogy is very important, as is epistemology, because the way that we're trained to experience the world, many of our students come from home cultures and communities where uh, authority doesn't come from how many books you've read or your distance from a subject, which is how the academy trains us to see objectivity. Don't don't have an attachment to your subject, otherwise you'll appear to be biased, and therefore less of an expert. Many of our students come from communities where, in fact, experience and investment in a subject means that you are working harder to get it right and to really understand it, as opposed to your distance from it. Or even call and response traditions, right? That you're giving a lecture and everyone's supposed to silently sit and take notes, as opposed to a much more interactive, engaging style, which everyone's not comfortable with. But yeah, I mean, I think taking up taking up pedagogy as a political intervention is really important, and it often never gets on the agenda of various diversity initiatives. And even that term, of course, just gives me chills, because it so often means cosmetic changes without substantive changes. So if you want a diverse group of faculty, in other words, if you want the people who've been excluded from the academy to come in, but you don't want them to come in with their ways of speaking, with their vernacular, with their different maybe ways of knowing the world and engaging the world, then you're really not asking for diversity. You're asking for a cosmetic facelift to what already exists, right? So yeah, I mean, again, I think pedagogy is very important. We're doing a project here. We're calling it the Maroon University, and we are going to experiment with courses and teaching and learning as a two-way street. Classrooms without tuition, without walls, without grades. It's quite on the fringes of the university. And I would say my most invigorating intellectual experiences, as someone who has taught and lived in university spaces for most of my adult life, most of my most invigorating intellectual experiences have been outside of universities. So what does that say? That said, we have to create learning spaces that are not the modules on the grid, with the rigidity and formulaic, prescriptions that we inherit, through our training in the academy. So that's what I would say.
This is a question I think is connected to the previous question, but it's about particularly maybe what, in this conjuncture where race, capitalism, and the pandemic collide, what specific things do you see, or maybe different goals and aims for particularly Afro-American or Black studies, right? That Afro-American Black studies might do differently, what Black studies, Afro-American studies, or African-American studies scholarship might look like at this moment, how it might look differently.
Yeah. Well, I guess two things. And Black studies, I'm in Chicago. So you really have to work hard to not be aware of, connected to, impacted by what's happening in this city in Black communities. But there are a lot of academics who work hard to not pay attention to, not be connected to, and certainly not be engaged with the larger community. I think the task of Black studies is to be a part of a larger Black world, Black politic, and Black movement. You know, many years ago, I think it was maybe 1999 or something like that, Manning Marable and I think it was Skip Gates at the time debated in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and was kind of a big spread, the future of Black studies, taking it to the streets. And it was about, you know, should Black studies, does Black studies have a different mission, you know, than any other academic department, or should it strive for the same, you know, as some would say, models of excellence as other departments do, and not take on another mission or a larger mission, et cetera. Well, Manning was of the mind, and I am of the mind, that, you know, Black studies are, and I would say gender and women's studies, Latinx studies, queer studies, many of the interdisciplinary programs have a different origin and do indeed have a different mission. And that doesn't mean that we compromise on the rigor of our research or the creativity and engagement in our teaching, but it means that, you know, Black intellectual communities, for the most part, for much of the history of Black, you know, writing and public, you know, exchange of ideas, has been outside the academy or on the margins of the academy because there was no place, right? And the people who made the space that we now occupy, many of them never got to come in and sit down and settle in themselves. So when Chicago exploded after Dr. King's assassination in 1968, universities in and around Chicago wanted to hire Black professors. And one of my former colleagues, Sterling Plump, used to say, University of Illinois didn't hire me. The people on the west side of Chicago hired me, because people created the conditions that universities had to respond to. There have always been smart Black people. We're not just doing the work we're doing because we're smart. We're doing the work we're doing because people open the space that we occupy, and that something comes with that in terms of an obligation. And I think it is to try as much as we can to speak in accessible language, to be responsive to the needs, the impulse, and the questions of a community that is not a credentialed and tuition-paying community, and to take up those questions that we think will further the interest, the humanity, the well-being of the communities we come from and the communities that we study. So, yeah, I think there is a special mission for Black studies programs. And I think in this moment in particular, you know, I started off talking about the rise of proto-fascist movements and white nationalism. In this moment in particular, I think that there is a special mission for Black studies. Now, my former colleague, Rod Ferguson, who's just now gone to Yale, you know, writes about the ways in which, you know, interdisciplinary programs have been, in some instances, in many instances, kind of hijacked and put into the service of a kind of neoliberal university by offering a cosmetic veneer of diversity without making real kinds of changes in terms of the locus of power or the way we do our work, not really contesting some of the very problematic and I would say colonial methods and structures of the university, of the academy. So anything is co-optable, but I think having these kinds of discussions are really important in re-anchoring us and re-anchoring us in what is needed in this time. That was a little too long-winded, I'm sorry.
So I think we have time for maybe one or two additional questions. And this is me sort of manipulating somebody else's question a little bit. I think the question is, so you started your talk by speaking of promise and peril. And I wonder what your assessment is of now on the other side of the election, with, with the beginning of the Biden administration. People can change, but we we have the president that we have, and I just wonder, from your own position, your own perspective, what this spells for movement organizing, for activism, for all those things in the new era.
Mm-hmm. Well, Biden was not my first choice or my second choice, or maybe not my third choice. No, I think this was this election, it was important for movement activists and organizers to weigh in to defeat Trump. That Trump represented a real a neo-fascist threat. I think he despite all the rhetoric of individual liberties and all that, I think there was a very strong, and is still a very strong, authoritarian impulse in the white nationalist organizations, which are a quite eclectic group, by the way. So I think it was right to invest in the electoral justice work through the Electoral Justice Project, through the Frontline, through the Working Families Party, through Justice Democrats, all these different organizations that, a whole bunch of more liberal organizations as well, to make sure that a right-wing white supremacist president didn't get another term in office. That said, I think, some of the internal debates now have been, is the major threat a return to sort of neoliberalism? And we know, Biden's history, having taken us into the war in Iraq, having been, supported the 1994 crime bill, and really contributed to to this buildup of targeted mass incarceration, and a number of other things. So there is a real neoliberal threat. And there is the danger of we don't see it quite yet in the way that I thought we might, but a kind of, we've got to reach across the aisle. We've got to bond with the moderate, reasonable Republicans. The left is asking for too much, and we have to go the middle of the road. There is a danger of that. And the danger of that in this moment is a serious danger, because austerity, given the number of frontline workers, overwhelmingly women of color, given the number of people who are facing evictions, given the life-altering dangers, the life-threatening dangers that people are facing, an austerity strategy, a privatization, a pullback, a step back, would really be deadly. So there's that threat on the one hand, and then there's the right-wing threat of these very heavily armed white vigilantes who, are not done yet. I mean, they felt emboldened by what happened on January 6th. I think the progressive forces in this, which I consider myself a part of, that we have to learn to politically walk and chew gum at the same time. That there is working inside, outside, and in some ways against, the apparatuses of the state. But we have now a very small left inside the Democratic Party. They're fledgling, but a Cori Bush, AOC, a Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, these people represent a different voice inside Congress. And so it's worth amplifying that voice and not abandoning that strategy. But it would be a dire mistake if movement organizers only invested in electoral work and did not do the kind of mobilizing and organizing at the community level that they have been doing and need to do even more. So yes, I think there's a right-wing threat and there's a neoliberal threat. And we have to be worried about both of them. But there's also possibility.
Yes. So Joe and I would really like to thank you, Dr. Ransby, for being with us this afternoon. We so appreciate all of your insights and your scholarship and your activism work. And I think, Joe, you would agree with me that this just hit all the high watermarks for us in terms of what we're trying to do in our department and with our speaker series and in our own shared pedagogy. And so we're just very, very grateful to you.
Thank you so
Stay
much.
warm in Chicago.
It's snowing outside right now, but,
Yeah.
this was a very warm and welcoming conversation. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the work that you're doing. And maybe we will actually see one another in person one day and have these conversations part 2.
I hope
Yeah,
so.
that would be great. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.